Hello, Internet. It's been a while, and it's been quite the year. If you're wondering what this is, it is my year-end vlogs, the video series where I set up my camera and talk at it about an unspecified topic for an unspecified amount of time, just various topics that I feel like talking about, and I do this once a day, each day following Christmas, leading up to New Year's Eve. And so, yeah, since I don't really feel like unpacking everything just yet, I'm going to start with something that's a little bit more fun for me to talk about, and that is movies. I'm calling this my holiday movie roundup, where I talk about 3 movies that came out during this holiday season and just give you my thoughts on them. Pretty straightforward. Those of you who are watching this on TikTok will notice it's pretty similar to the reviews I've been doing, but unlike those reviews, I'm not going to really be following a specific format or giving a score. This is just me discussing each of these 3 films and just giving my general thoughts about them and whether or not I would recommend them. So, yeah. Alright, so the first film that I'm wanting to talk about is Lord of the Rings War of the Rohirrim, directed by Kenji Kamiyama. Now, I'm not super familiar with Kamiyama's work. I know he worked on stuff like Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex and Eden of the East. Yes, I'm an anime fan, but that doesn't mean I have time to watch every single anime produced ever, so yeah, I kind of went into this largely blind, but more or less curious to see what an anime Lord of the Rings film would look like. Now, when it comes to the story that this film is trying to tell, it's a serviceable plot, as a nice, smaller scale conflict that just happens to take place in Middle-earth. It's okay. It's not the most groundbreaking. It has some unique moments to itself and some really good ideas, but beyond that, it's serviceable. And honestly, I think what hurts it is the fact that they tried to add in certain elements that more closely tie it to the events of The Lord of the Rings. Now, the Christopher Lee cameo I wasn't as bothered by because, yeah, he is the head of Isengard. It would make sense that he would appear at the very end of the story. But then some of the other elements that they tried to work in to make it more tied into Lord of the Rings felt largely unnecessary. Now, when it comes to the animation, the overall visual style and the overall visual aesthetic looks really good. And there are moments in this film that, when it looks good, it looks really good. But there are a number of moments that really, really lack in polish. I think a large part of it comes down to 2 key things. One is that there are some sequences in this film that feel over-animated. Looking at 2D animation specifically, you have what is called keyframes. These are basically the key poses that exist in a shot that a character will take in a given sequence. And then you have the in-betweens, which are what create the illusion of movement that basically make animation. If you draw too many in-between frames in between your keyframes, this can make things look very floaty and very slow and look really awkward. It makes it look like rotoscoping, but worse, is how I would describe it. And that's what happens with a few key moments, particularly at the very beginning of the film. As the film wears on, it improves a little bit, and you can tell that a lot of the attention was paid on the final big climactic battle at the end of the film, because that is probably the most polished part of the whole thing. Another issue with the animation is the fact that sometimes the character facial expressions don't match up with the vocal performance that we are getting from the voice actors. You'll have the voice actors giving like really emotional dialogue where they're either really angry or they're really scared or they're really sad, and you can hear that emotion in their voice, but then their faces have this static robot look because it's like, no, we have to stay on model. No, the female character has to look pretty. Even if she is meant to be crying or angry, she has to look pretty. And it's not limited just to Hera, the main heroine of the film. That's even seen in some other key characters where you hear Helm Hammerhand giving like this rousing like speech of like being angry and stuff like that, but then his face looks static and completely emotionless, even though you hear this dialogue that is being very emotional and meant to be like, oh yeah, he's giving a big rousing speech, but his face doesn't move. Overall, with War of the Rohirrim, it's serviceable at best. Would I have paid full price for it if I was given the choice? Probably not, but as a piece of Lord of the Rings media, it's okay. Kind of boring at times, some really good ideas and some really good fight scenes, but it's just okay. I do like the idea of giving other animators concepts from the Lord of the Rings just to see what they do with this. So if this was part of like a larger anthology of films that just explore different aspects of Middle-earth through the lens of different anime directors, I would actually be more open to seeing more films like that, kind of creating a Lord of the Rings equivalent of the Animatrix or Batman Gotham Knight. The next film I want to talk about is Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Now, cards on the table, I did go into it with a little bit of a bias. I mean, I grew up playing the games, and both Sonic Adventure 2 Battle on the Nintendo GameCube and Shadow the Hedgehog, I have my copy for PlayStation 2, and I still have my copy of the game. These were very much a part of my childhood, so naturally, the prospect of seeing Shadow the Hedgehog in the film universe was really exciting, especially when it was announced that he was being voiced by Keanu Reeves. And so, I was really excited going into this movie, and I feel that my excitement was warranted. This is a really, really good, entertaining movie, and it has a lot of nice elements and callbacks and Easter eggs for fans of the games like myself to pick up on. As an adaptation of Sonic the Hedgehog, it's completely serviceable, but I did have some problems with it, particularly when it comes to its tone. For me, watching this and seeing the amount of love of the games that was put into this film, it makes certain elements that are part of the film continuity very much at odds with some of the deeper cuts into Sonic lore that the film tried to work in. And this is seen most especially, as much as it pains me to say, with Jim Carrey's performance as both Ivo and Gerald Robotnik. Now, it's obvious that Jim Carrey was having a lot of fun with these performances, and honestly, if they didn't try to work in as much of the more serious, more dramatic sides of Shadow's mythology, it would still work pretty well. But especially during the final climax, where you have some of these really intense dramatic moments that are then intercut by Jim Carrey doing what he's paid to do, it led to some moments of tonal whiplash. Now, it wasn't as bad as I've seen in other films. I feel they managed to balance it fairly well, because the film goes in with this idea that, hey, you're not supposed to be taking this super seriously. We know this whole thing is ridiculous, so we're just kind of embracing it. And I think that was really the only thing that kind of felt distracting, is that some of the more comedic elements as the film wore on started to get a little bit distracting during moments that were supposed to be more dramatic. So they handled it fairly well. That's just the only major thing I noticed. But aside from that, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, perfectly entertaining film. As a fan of the games, I was satisfied. And now for the third film that I want to talk about, and this is the film that I went and saw today at an early afternoon showing at a very, very packed movie theater. I mean, even this showing was actually pretty busy. And that is the remake of Nosferatu by Robert Eggers. I didn't go into this film completely blind. I went into this as someone who is both familiar with the original silent film version, as well as the behind-the-scenes history of the silent film version. And so that did color a lot of my perception of this remake going in, for better and for worse. Now, when it comes to the film as a whole, it is very, very bleak, but I would argue that it's very much by design. I mean, it is a very, very bleak story when you look at the story of Nosferatu specifically. Now, when it comes to the story as a whole, like I mentioned, it's pretty bleak, and it also has a bit of a slow pace. I imagine they were kind of going for a bit of a slow burn, but there wasn't really much of a mystery or a payoff to it per se. They tried to set it up, but they almost kind of sabotaged themselves with certain visual beats. When it comes to the visual aesthetic of the film, it very much leans more heavily into the gray, bleak, black and white sort of approach, and less onto some of the more colorful flourishes that you would have seen in the original silent film version if you were watching it with the color tinting that would have been used at the time. Now, there are some versions of Nosferatu available on the internet that do have this color tinting in place. But when it comes to the visual aesthetic of this film, it does reference that color tinting to a degree when it comes to the usage of certain colors for certain sequences, but it feels a lot more subdued, where it very much feels like the film was very heavily desaturated, almost like it was afraid of color. Now, there is a bit of visual payoff towards the end of the film that I did appreciate at the end, and so I think that's kind of what Eggers was going for, but it can make for the bit of a bleak viewing experience. That said, there are some sequences in this film that look absolutely beautiful and are masterfully executed, especially when you get into some of the more surreal visuals. But then there are other moments where you can tell the filmmakers, Robert Eggers specifically, decide to basically drop all pretense. It's no secret that vampirism is often used as some sort of warning against promiscuity. And, well, the film pretty much just decides, you know what, yeah, let's not beat around the bush, we're gonna go full frontal. I don't blame them for wanting to abandon the pretense and be like, hey, let's just be upfront with what this is about. But as a result, it leads to some sequences that feel like they're basically trying to drive the point home, more or less because they don't have faith in the audience being able to follow what the theme of the story is. And moments like this also spill over into some of the dialogue exchanges, especially with some of the exchanges between Ellen, played by Lily Rose Depp, and Thomas, played by Nicholas Hoult, but even seen in some other sequences throughout the film, where they're effectively having to explain the theme of the story to the audience. And I feel that that's more indicative of the time period that we live in. Which leads to my next point. This film feels very much like a product of the 2020s, where there's almost kind of this viscerality to it, because, well, we all lived through a pandemic. And given that Nosferatu as a story deals with the Black Plague, you can tell that there's that anxiety, that sense of dread baked into the story, whether Eggers intended it or not. And that's one thing that the film is really good at, is building up its sense of atmosphere and building up this sense of dread, where you're basically just left in almost a constant state of terror. And I think that's pretty much the crux of what this film is trying to do throughout its entire runtime, is keeping you in this constant state of unease and this constant state of dread. Overall, Nosferatu, as an adaptation, I feel it does live up to the legacy of the original silent film directed by F.W. Murnau, and it has that added benefit of really speaking to those of us who have lived through the pandemic and really capturing that sense of dread and terror that just hung over everyone. Again, I don't know if that was Eggers' intention, but it's very much something that is in the story, that is just in the film itself. And so it's a case where either he worked it in intentionally or that's just what's come out. And I might even argue that it might even just be me bringing my own experiences into the showing. So those are my thoughts on 3 movies that have come out this holiday season. And yeah, I don't really know how to end this since I didn't really give any ratings or anything. So I'll simply say this. If you saw War of the Rohirrim, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, or the remake of Nosferatu, what did you guys think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And barring any surprises, I will hopefully see you all tomorrow for the next year-end vlog.